Hello, this is Jessica from truthathome.wordpress.com. And today I'd like to talk to you about some examples from the Old Testament where we see head covering being used. Before I start, I have my own head covering here that I'm going to go ahead and put on over my head because I consider sharing the Word of God with other people in kind of a more formal setup like this to be a situation where I need to put my head covering on. I consider it to be a form of prophesying. Alright, so now that I got that on, let's go ahead and get started. 10 examples of head covering in the Old Testament. Let's see if we can get through these smoothly and fairly quickly. The first example I want to show you is from Genesis chapter 24, verses 64 to 65. Then Rebekah lifted her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from her camel, for she had said to the servant, "Who is this man walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "It is my master." So she took a veil and covered herself. Wonderful picture of a soon-to-be bride covering herself before she meets her soon-to-be husband. It looks like it's done for propriety, perhaps for modesty. Next example. Okay, here we are in Exodus chapter 28. We're going to start out with verses 3 and 4. So you shall speak to all who are gifted artisans, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister to me as priest. And these are the garments which they shall make: a breastplate, an ephod, which is an ornamented vest, a robe, a skillfully woven tunic, a turban, and a sash. So they shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother and his sons, that he may minister to me as priest. Let's jump ahead to 40 to 41. Just turn the page. Here we are at 40 to 41. For Aaron's sons you shall make tunics, and you shall make sashes for them, and you shall make hats for them, for glory and beauty. So you shall put them on Aaron your brother, and on his sons with him. You shall anoint them, consecrate them, and sanctify them, that they may minister to me as priests. So we see here that the turban, or in other words the hat, was part of the priestly attire required for the priests in the Old Testament. Moving ahead. Another example of head covering in the Old Testament. Except for this isn't just head covering, this one's face covering too. In Exodus chapter 34, verses 29 to 35. Now it was so, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hand when he came down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone while he talked with him, meaning when he talked with God. So when Aaron and all the children of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. Then Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the rulers of the congregation returned to him, and Moses talked with them. Afterward all the children of Israel came near, and he gave them as commandments all that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil on his face. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take the veil off until he came out. And he would come out and speak to the children of Israel whatever he had been commanded. And whenever the children of Israel saw the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face shone, then Moses would put the veil on his face again until he went in to speak with them. So here we have Moses speaking with God, and his face starts to shine. That must have been a stunning sight. So when he spoke with the people, in order to cover up this glow, he put a veil over his face. It doesn't seem to be that he's covering his face for any reason other than that he's covering up that glow in order to not scare the people, perhaps. Here we go. Here's another example. Leviticus 10, verse 6. And Moses said to Aaron and to Eleazar and Ithamar his sons, do not uncover your heads nor tear your clothes, lest you die, and wrath come upon all the people. But let your brethren, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning which the Lord has kindled. Okay, so in this chapter 10 of Leviticus, we have the story of how Nadab and Abihu, the two other sons of Aaron, had offered incense to the Lord out of, it says, they each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died. Okay, then God said, in verse 3, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people, I must be glorified. And then later on, in verse 6, is the verse that I read to you. So apparently, Nadab and Abihu were killed for doing something that they weren't supposed to do. And even though Aaron was their father, and Eleazar and Ithamar were their brothers, they were not supposed to mourn for what these two other brothers had done, because it was a bad thing. They're going to keep on their turbans, they're going to keep on their clothes, they're not going to tear anything, because these two men deserved what they got. That's what it looks like to me. Okay, another example of head covering. Leviticus 13, verse 45. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn and his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. In this example, we see a leprous man having to have his head bare, covering up his mustache and saying unclean when he comes to people. So why did he have to leave his head bare? It looks to me from reading this section that part of the reason is because the leprosy, a symptom of the leprosy, could be seen on his head. So he would uncover his head in order to make it apparent that he had leprosy, sort of as a warning to other people to not come near him, so that they wouldn't get contaminated too and the disease wouldn't spread. So that's that reason for uncovering his head. Okay, here we have in Leviticus 21:10. It says, he who is the high priest among his brethren, on whose head the anointing oil was poured, and who was consecrated to wear the garments, shall not uncover his head nor tear his clothes. And then it continues on. In verse 11, nor shall he go near any dead body, nor defile himself for his father or his mother. Nor shall he go out of the sanctuary, in verse 12, nor profane the sanctuary of his God, for the consecration of the anointing oil of his God is upon him. I am the Lord. So apparently, even for a dead person, even if his father or his mother were to die, or for any other reason, a priest is not to take off his priestly garments. That's what it looks to be saying in this verse here. And we read a little bit about that with the case with Abihu and Nadab. Isn't that their names? Nadab and Abihu. We saw in that case that Aaron and his other sons were told not to take off their priestly garments at that point too, for those two dead men. All right, another example from the Old Testament. Numbers chapter 5, verse 18. Here we go. Then the priest shall stand the woman before the Lord. Now this is a woman who has been suspected of adultery. Uncover the woman's head and put the offering for remembering in her hands, which is the grain offering of jealousy. And the priest shall have in his hand the bitter water that brings a curse. If you want to read more out of Numbers chapter 5 about that, it's pretty interesting. So apparently this woman is suspected of adultery, hasn't been confirmed yet, so she's under investigation still. And basically the priest is going to uncover this woman's head. Why does he do that? I'm going to take a guess here and say that it seems to me like it's a way of saying, hey, we're all standing here together, investigating this serious issue. There is nothing hidden. You're going to stand as you are, and we're going to look at you and your life, and we're going to see the truth about you. So it's almost like you take the covering off to say nothing's covered here, nothing's hidden here. Another reason that I can think of that makes sense to me is that if he's going to uncover her head, and it specifically mentions that, it seems that a woman having her head covered must have been a normal thing for it to talk about it in this way. So normally a woman would have her head covered, maybe like Rebecca, for modesty or for propriety. And then to take that covering off is like a way of saying, hey, you have put yourself to shame. You are no longer a dignified woman. I mean, we haven't confirmed your adultery yet, but the fact that it's even in question is a shameful matter. So that's just a couple guesses of mine, but they seem to make sense, right? All right, moving forward. Let's move forward to 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 30. So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went up, and he had his head covered and went barefoot. And all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up, weeping as they went up. So Absalom, David's son, basically betrayed his father and set himself up as king instead. And David and the other people who were still loyal to him had no choice but to flee from Jerusalem. And as they fled, David covered his head and went barefoot. And the people, apparently men and women, a mixed group, they also covered their heads. So to me, this instance of covering heads indicates sorrow and mourning, perhaps despair. And this is a little bit of a different reason for covering than we've seen in those other examples. Let's move forward to 1 Kings. 1 Kings 19, verse 13. So it was when Elijah heard it that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So why did he wrap his face in his mantle? Now, this wasn't just his head. This was his face. Why did he do that? Well, if you read a little bit before, we see that he had been standing on a mountain, and the Lord had passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. When Elijah heard that still small voice, that's when he wrapped his face in his mantle. Why did he do that? I think that it was to show respect towards God, and also because he feared God. These things that had happened, the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, they must have been awesome to behold. And so the most natural human reaction after seeing an awesome act of God is to humble yourself and to basically say, God, I am not worthy of you. That's what I would do, wouldn't you? So he wraps his face in his mantle, and that's when he talks to God. Maybe he's almost afraid too that, God's great power would, be too much for him. Perhaps he doesn't want to risk seeing God's glory and, dying. We see that talked about when Moses wanted to behold God's glory, and God said, no, you can only see the hind part of my glory, but not the full part of my glory, the fullness of my glory, because then you would die. And when God passed by the mountain, he covered Moses so that he could only see the little tiny bit of a hind part of his glory, and even that was a huge huge thing, So maybe Elijah was thinking the same thing might happen to him if he came out and he talked to God and he saw God and in all his glory, that maybe he'd die. So maybe he covered his face in his mantle to not risk that. Taking a guess here, but it kind of makes sense to me. The last example we're going to look at, this is number 10. In Esther chapter 6, verse 12. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. So who are these people? Well, if you've read the book of Esther, Esther is a great story. It's only 10 chapters long. It's actually a really great and quick read. 10 chapters sounds like a lot, but it's such an interesting story that once you start, you don't want to stop. I would recommend that you read that if you haven't. Haman was an evil man, and he hated this other man named Mordecai. However, the king wanted to do something to honor Mordecai, and Haman was forced to honor his enemy by leading Mordecai around on a horse and saying, with kingly garments and a signet ring on his hand, I believe, and lead him around the city and saying, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Let me go back and just make sure I'm right about that. Yes, a royal robe that the king has worn, a horse on which the king has ridden, and a royal crest placed on his head. So maybe I'm not right about the ring, but all those other things Haman had to do to Mordecai in order to show that the king delighted in Mordecai. But Mordecai was Haman's enemy. So for Haman, this evil man, this was a great humiliation to have to lead his enemy around, honoring him. So clearly when he was done with it, he got through it. But finally when he was done, he went back to his house and he was mourning. He was humiliated. He was so ashamed and so embarrassed. So he covered his head because of that. All right, now here we see 10 examples from the Old Testament of head covering. Now, there might be more examples from the Old Testament. These are just 10 that I chose for now, that are the ones that I found to share with you. If you do find more examples, go ahead and let me know. Leave a comment in the comment section and provide the reference, and it'll be great to have that to add to my list of examples from the New Testament. Let's wrap this all up. There have been various reasons why people covered in the Old Testament. So we've looked at a few. Rebecca covered perhaps for modesty or propriety. The priests covered their heads with the turban because that was part of their outfit that was designed by God for them. David, when he was fleeing his son Absalom, covered perhaps out of mourning, out of sorrow. Haman covered his head because he was humiliated. Let's see, Moses covered his face because his face was shining with the glory of God. And he, I guess, didn't want to scare the people with that shining face. Elijah covered his face with the mantle when he went out to meet God after seeing God's awesome and powerful acts. Seems like I'm missing one. Oh, a leper was told to do the opposite, not cover his head, but uncover his head in order so that people could see that he was a leper as a warning so that the disease wouldn't spread. And another case of uncovering was an adulterous woman under investigation having to uncover her head. And I think I covered everything. The priests were also told not to uncover their heads, not even for a dead person, not even if that dead person was their own brother or son or mother or father. So the only instance out of all of these examples that I see where head covering was a command in the Old Testament was in regards to the priests. God told them to put a turban on their heads. So they had as men, they had to cover their heads, which is exactly the opposite of what the New Testament command is. The New Testament command in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 1 to 16, is for men to to uncover their heads. It's the opposite. In the Old Testament, they had to cover, at least, well, not all the men, but the priests. And in the New Testament, now all Christian men are to uncover their heads when they are praying or prophesying. So it's the opposite, and there's several different differences. Like I said, it was just the priests in the Old Testament who had to cover their heads. But now in the New Testament, we have all Christian men during the specific acts of praying and prophesying who have to uncover their heads. Why that difference? The biggest thing I can think of is that, well, we don't have priests anymore. We don't need priests. As Christians, as followers of Christ, we don't need priests in that sense anymore. Because Jesus, he came, he died, he rose from the grave. The veil in the temple was torn from the top to the bottom, and we can now come before God directly with no need of a priesthood. If you want to read more about that, you can read about that in the book of Hebrews, which talks all about that subject. So we no longer need the priesthood. So it makes sense that along with the priesthood going out, their clothing, their attire would go out with it. Now we have something new set up. Now we have the church, the bride of Christ. That's something that didn't exist in the Old Testament. This is the New Testament. So now we have the bride of Christ, the church, and we have a specific, unique instruction just for us now. When are we supposed to stop obeying this instruction, which is defended? Not only is it described, but it's defended in 1 Corinthians 11. When are we going to stop obeying this teaching? We don't know. Whenever God says, okay, now it's time to stop. But we don't stop obeying the head covering instructions when our culture changes or when our feelings change. The only time that we're going to stop doing this is when God says, okay, things have changed now. It's time to stop. Now I have something new for you to do. But until that time, we need to keep obeying it. Another thing that comes to mind after reading these 10 examples from the Old Testament is that apart from the command given to the priests, all the other examples of head covering were very different. The reasons for the people covering either their heads or veiling their faces or uncovering their heads were all different reasons. And they weren't based on any commands. It was just what that person felt like doing in that moment. And I think that even today, there's a lot of reasons why people might cover their heads. Maybe they're cold. Maybe it's cold outside and they want to put on a hat or a scarf. Maybe it's fashionable. Maybe they, it's a fashion accessory to them and they think it looks good. Maybe they are trying to show, that they're humiliated and they're full of sorrow or whatever. So there could be many various reasons why people today might cover based upon their situation and their feelings. But as followers of Christ, we have a command to cover in the New Testament that doesn't have anything to do with our feelings or our changing situations. This isn't just something that's described in passing, like in the Old Testament. Yes, this person uncovered his head for this reason, and that person covered her head for that reason. It's not just, kind of mentioned in passing, but it's a command that is defended, and the reasons are clearly given. So it's in a totally different category than these examples that we read from the Old Testament. So is head covering in the Old Testament? There are examples of head covering in the Old Testament. Yes, there are. And there was a command for the priest to wear turbans in the Old Testament. Yes, there was. But we no longer need to have that priesthood. Things have changed. Now as New Testament believers, we have a new and unique command for us in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 1 to 16. That's my topic for today. If you have anything to add, feel free to add your thoughts in the comment section. And like I said before, if you have any other references in the Old Testament to head covering, please feel free to share them in the comment section below. Again, I'm Jessica. My blog is truthathome.wordpress.com. I hope you all have a really awesome day, and I pray that you will be blessed by the Lord to understand His truths more clearly and more deeply. Thanks so much. Bye.